There are moments in a woman's life when humiliation carves itself so deeply into her soul that she believes she will never again stand tall, never again feel the warmth of hope kindle in her chest, never again trust that the world might hold something beautiful in store for her. And then, against all expectation, against all reason, love arrives in the most unlikely of forms and proves that the heart, once shattered, can be made whole again in ways more magnificent than its original design. Lady Eleanor Ashworth knew the depths of such humiliation intimately, had lived with its bitter taste upon her tongue for 2 long years, had worn its invisible scars beneath the dignified composure she presented to the world like armor forged from necessity and pain. She was the daughter of Viscount Ashworth, a man whose name had once commanded respect in the finest drawing rooms of London, whose fortune had once been substantial enough to secure his only child's future with comfortable certainty. Eleanor herself possessed every quality that should have guaranteed her a brilliant match. She was intelligent, having devoured the contents of her father's library before her 16th birthday. She was accomplished in music and languages, and the delicate art of conversation. She was beautiful in that quiet, arresting way that revealed itself slowly, her chestnut hair catching light like burnished copper, her grey eyes holding depths that reflected both keen observation and gentle warmth. Her features were classical and fine, her figure elegant, her bearing that of a woman raised to grace ballrooms and manage great houses. Yet none of these qualities had protected her on that terrible evening 2 years past, when everything she believed about love and her own worth had crumbled to ash before the watching eyes of all London society. She had been 20 years old, standing in the glittering ballroom of the Pemberton estate, wearing her finest silk gown of pale rose, her heart so full of joy she thought it might burst from her chest. Lord Frederick Blackwood had been courting her for 3 months, had whispered promises against her gloved hand, had looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold genuine affection. She had believed herself loved, believed herself on the precipice of a proposal that would unite her future with a man she had come to adore with all the passionate certainty of youth. But that very afternoon, news had spread through society with vicious speed. The Ashworth fortune was gone, lost to failed investments and debts that could never be repaid. Eleanor had not known, had been shielded from the truth by her father's desperate attempts to salvage something from the wreckage. She learned it in the worst possible way, standing before Frederick as his expression shifted from warmth to cold calculation, as he released her hand, as though her touch had become contaminated by poverty. His voice carried across the ballroom, pitched deliberately to reach curious ears, each word a knife driven into her heart with surgical precision. "Come now, Lady Eleanor," he had said with a cruel smile twisting his handsome features. "You cannot expect me to continue this charade. I have just learned the truth of your circumstances. A pretty face with empty pockets is hardly worth the trouble. I require a wife who brings more to a marriage than pleasant conversation and desperate hope." The laughter that rippled through the assembled guests, the pitying glances, the whispered commentary behind fans and gloved hands. Eleanor had stood frozen, her world collapsing around her while she struggled simply to breathe, to maintain some fragment of dignity as her dreams turned to dust at her feet. 2 years had passed since that devastating evening, and Eleanor had rebuilt herself from the ruins of her former dreams into something harder, more practical, stripped of the romantic foolishness that had nearly destroyed her. She lived now at Ashworth Manor, though the word manor had become something of a bitter jest, for the estate that had once boasted manicured gardens and a full staff of servants had fallen into genteel decay, its roof leaking in 3 places, its once elegant rooms grown cold and draughty, its grounds tended only by Eleanor herself and an elderly gardener who stayed out of loyalty rather than wages they could no longer pay. Her mother had passed when Eleanor was 12, leaving her to navigate the treacherous waters of society with only her father's distracted guidance, and now she served as nurse, housekeeper, and companion to the man whose failed investments had brought them to this pass. Viscount Ashworth had aged decades in the span of 2 years, his guilt over their circumstances manifesting in a wasting illness that kept him confined to his bed more days than not, his once robust frame diminished to frailty, his eyes carrying a perpetual apology whenever they met his daughter's gaze. Eleanor never blamed him, not truly, for she understood that he had gambled their fortune in desperate attempts to secure her future, that every failed investment had been made with her happiness in mind, and the knowledge of his intentions made his failure all the more painful to witness. She had learned to manage their household with almost nothing, to make thin soup stretch for days, to mend her worn gowns until the fabric grew too fragile to hold stitches, to dismiss all thoughts of society and balls and the glittering world that had once seemed her birthright. The invitations had stopped coming years ago, and Eleanor found she did not miss them for what awaited her in ballrooms, but whispered reminders of her humiliation, pitying glances from former friends, and the ever-present possibility of encountering Lord Frederick Blackwood and his wealthy bride. She had accepted, with the grim practicality that had become her defining characteristic, that romantic love was a luxury she could not afford, a dangerous fantasy that had nearly broken her spirit beyond repair, and she would not make the mistake of believing in it again. Her days followed a quiet rhythm of caring for her father, reading to him from the books they could not bear to sell, walking the overgrown paths of their garden, and planning for a future that seemed to hold nothing but uncertainty. When her father passed, and the doctors had made clear that his condition would only deteriorate, Eleanor would have no choice but to seek employment as a governess, trading the remnants of her dignity for the security of a roof over her head and food in her stomach. She had already begun composing letters of inquiry in her mind, rehearsing the humble phrases she would need to use when applying to families who had once been her social equals, and she told herself that there were worse fates than teaching other people's children, that honest work was nothing to be ashamed of, that she would survive as she had survived everything else, through sheer, stubborn will. The letter arrived on a grey Tuesday morning, carried by a courier whose fine livery stood in stark contrast to the shabby entrance hall where Eleanor received him, and the moment her eyes fell upon the seal, pressed into the crimson wax, a wolf rampant beneath a ducal coronet, her blood turned to ice in her veins, for she recognized that seal from whispered conversations and newspaper accounts and the fearful gossip that circulated through even the most isolated corners of English society. The Duke of Ashworth, Marcus Thorne, was a name spoken in hushed tones, a figure of dark legend whose reputation preceded him like a shadow blotting out the sun. It was said that he had driven his first wife to madness with his coldness, that she had wasted away in the corridors of his vast estate, crying out for affection that never came until death claimed her as a mercy. It was said that servants fled his household after mere weeks, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere of his presence, that his tenants crossed themselves when his carriage passed, that he conducted business with a ruthlessness that had destroyed lesser men and built his fortune upon their ruin. It was said, most damningly of all, that no one had ever witnessed the Duke's smile, that his face was carved from the same stone as the ancient gargoyles that guarded his ancestral home, and that to meet his gaze was to feel the warmth drain from one's very soul. Eleanor broke the seal with trembling fingers, scanning the brief, imperious lines that demanded an audience with Viscount Ashworth regarding a matter of urgent financial concern, and when she brought the letter to her father's bedside, she watched what little color remained in his hollow cheeks drain away entirely, leaving him gray as the sheets upon which he lay. The confession that followed shattered what remained of Eleanor's illusions about their circumstances, for she learned that her father's desperation had driven him to darker measures than she had ever imagined, that 3 years passed. When the investments first began to fail and creditors circled like vultures, he had borrowed an enormous sum from the Duke of Ashworth, believing he could recover their fortunes before repayment came due. The debt had grown with interest, compounding into a sum so vast that Eleanor could scarcely comprehend it, and now the Duke had called it in, demanding either payment in full or satisfaction of another kind. Her father wept as he told her, his frail body shaking with sobs that seemed to drain what little strength remained to him, begging her forgiveness for the doom he had brought upon them both, and Eleanor could only hold his hand and murmur reassurances she did not feel, her mind racing through possibilities that led nowhere but ruin. The Duke would arrive tomorrow, the letter stated, to discuss terms, and as Eleanor sat beside her father's bed through the long hours of the night, she could not shake the sensation that fate itself was descending upon their crumbling home, wearing the face of the cruelest man in England. The Duke of Ashworth arrived precisely at noon the following day, his black carriage cutting through the overgrown drive like a blade through flesh, drawn by 4 matched horses of such magnificent breeding that their value alone could have sustained Eleanor and her father for years, and she watched from the window of her father's bedchamber as the vehicle came to a halt before their crumbling entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force that she feared it might shatter. The man who emerged from that carriage was everything the rumors had promised and somehow more. Tall and broad-shouldered in a way that seemed to dwarf the very air around him, his dark hair swept back from a face that might have been carved by a sculptor who had never learned the meaning of mercy. A severe jaw, sharp cheekbones, a mouth set in a line so firm it seemed incapable of softening, and eyes of such piercing ice-blue intensity that Eleanor felt their weight even from her distant vantage point, felt them sweep across the facade of her home with an assessment that surely found it wanting. He wore black, as if in perpetual mourning or perhaps as a warning to all who encountered him, and he moved with the controlled power of a predator who had never known the experience of being prey, each step deliberate, each gesture economical, wasting nothing on pleasantries or performance. Eleanor descended to meet him in the entrance hall, having arranged her features into what she hoped was dignified composure, and when those terrible eyes turned upon her for the first time, she understood why servants fled his household, why grown men trembled in his presence, for his gaze seemed to penetrate every defense she had built, to see through the careful mask she wore to the frightened woman beneath. He did not bow, did not offer any of the social niceties that gentlemen employed when meeting ladies of quality, merely stated his name as if she could not possibly be ignorant of it, and demanded to be shown to the Viscount immediately. Eleanor led him up the worn stairs to her father's chambers, acutely aware of his presence behind her, of the way the air itself seemed to grow heavier with each step, and when they entered the sick room and the Duke's gaze fell upon the wasted figure in the bed, her father, who had once stood proud and tall, now reduced to skin, stretched over fragile bones, something flickered in those ice-blue depths, something that might have been recognition or pity, or perhaps merely distaste, before his expression hardened once more into granite impassivity. He dismissed Eleanor with a curt nod, informing her that he would speak with her father alone. That business between gentlemen was not a matter for feminine ears, and though the words sparked a flare of indignation in her breast, she retreated as commanded, closing the door behind her and pressing her back against the wall of the corridor, straining to hear what transpired within, while her imagination conjured terrors too numerous to name. The door to her father's bedchamber opened after what seemed an eternity, and the Duke emerged with an expression that revealed nothing of what had transpired within, his ice-blue eyes finding Eleanor where she stood, pressed against the corridor wall with the inevitability of a hawk locating its prey, and he addressed her without preamble or softening, his voice carrying the same clipped authority with which he conducted all his affairs. He informed her that he had reached an arrangement with her father, one that would resolve all outstanding debts and ensure the Viscount received the finest medical care available for whatever time remained to him, physicians from London, comfortable accommodations, servants to attend his every need, all of this provided, without condition or future obligation, the slate wiped clean, as if the debt had never existed. Eleanor felt her knees weaken with relief, felt tears prick at her eyes at this unexpected mercy from a man renowned for showing none, and she began to stammer her gratitude, but the Duke silenced her with a raised hand and continued speaking, his tone unchanging as he laid out the terms of this salvation. In exchange for his generosity, he required something from her, not money, for she had none, not property, for what remained was worthless, but herself, her hand in marriage, her body to provide him with an heir, her presence at his side as Duchess of Ashworth. He had made inquiries, he explained with brutal efficiency, and had learned that she was sensible, educated, possessed of dignity and discretion, not given to the hysterics and romantic foolishness that plagued most women of her class. In short, she was exactly what he required in a wife, a practical partner who would understand that their union was a transaction of mutual benefit rather than some sentimental fantasy. He did not expect affection, he stated flatly, nor would he offer it, for he had no capacity for such things and no interest in pretending otherwise. But he would provide her with comfort, security, a position of respect, and the knowledge that her father would live out his remaining days in peace rather than poverty. Eleanor listened to this extraordinary proposition with a strange sense of calm settling over her, for had she not already learned the harsh lesson that romantic love was a chimera, a beautiful lie that existed only to wound those foolish enough to believe in it, and was not a practical arrangement based on honest expectations, infinitely preferable to promises of devotion that would inevitably prove false. She thought of her father lying in that bed, thought of the creditors who would descend like wolves once news of his death spread, thought of her own bleak future as a governess dependent on the charity of strangers, and she recognized that the Duke's offer, cold as it was, represented the only path forward that did not end in complete ruin. She raised her chin, met those piercing ice-blue eyes without flinching, and accepted his proposal with what dignity she could muster. Her voice steady even as her heart felt as though it were being locked away in a chest and buried somewhere deep where it could never again be broken, and the Duke nodded once, as if she had merely confirmed an entry in a ledger, before turning and descending the stairs to make arrangements for their wedding. The wedding took place 3 days hence in the small chapel attached to her father's estate, a swift and austere affair devoid of flowers or music, or any of the trappings that young girls dream of when they imagine their wedding day, and Eleanor stood before the ancient altar in a simple gown of pale ivory that had belonged to her mother, her hands trembling so violently that she feared she might drop the prayer book. She clutched like a talisman against the strangeness of what she was about to do. Her father had been carried down in a chair borne by 2 of the Duke's footmen, his face grey with exhaustion, but his eyes bright with something that might have been hope or might have been grief, and he watched from the front pew as his only daughter pledged herself to a man she had known for mere days, a man whose reputation painted him as a monster, a man who stood beside her now reciting his vows in a voice so cold and measured that he might have been reading terms from a business contract rather than binding himself to her for eternity. The Duke's solicitor served as witness, scratching notes in a leather-bound book with mechanical precision, and when the elderly vicar pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss to seal the union, merely a curt nod from the Duke and a document to sign, and Eleanor wrote her new name, Eleanor Thorne, Duchess of Ashworth, with a hand that had finally steadied into something like resignation. The journey to Thornwood Castle took the better part of a day, miles of countryside rolling past the carriage windows, while Eleanor sat in silence across from her new husband, who spent the hours reviewing papers and correspondence as if she were not there at all, as if the woman he had just married were merely another piece of furniture in the well-appointed carriage. When they finally arrived, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, casting long shadows across an estate that stole Eleanor's breath even as it chilled her heart. Thornwood Castle rose from the landscape like something out of a Gothic novel, all towering spires and ancient stone walls covered in climbing ivy, beautiful in the way that storms are beautiful, magnificent and terrible, and utterly indifferent to the small human creatures who dared to approach. The staff lined up to greet their new mistress, a sea of faces wearing expressions of barely concealed curiosity, and Eleanor felt their eyes cataloguing her simple gown, her tired face, the way she flinched slightly when the Duke placed his hand at the small of her back to guide her inside. Mrs. Blackwood, the elderly housekeeper with steel-grey hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, led Eleanor to her chambers, a beautiful suite of rooms decorated in soft blues and creams, comfortable and elegant, but separated from the Duke's apartments by an entire wing of the castle. That night, her wedding night, Eleanor sat alone before the fire in her new chambers, still wearing her mother's ivory gown because she had not yet found the will to remove it, and she stared into the flames and wondered what fate she had sealed herself into, wondered if the security she had purchased for her father had cost her whatever remained of her soul, wondered if the cold man she had married would ever look at her and see anything more than a transaction successfully completed. The days that followed blurred together in a strange rhythm of solitude, punctuated by brief, uncomfortable encounters with the man who was now her husband, for the Duke kept himself occupied with the endless business of managing his vast estates, leaving before dawn and returning well after Eleanor had taken her supper alone in the cavernous dining room, and when they did find themselves sharing a meal, the conversation consisted of little more than polite inquiries about her comfort and her monosyllabic assurances that all was well, the silence between them thick enough to touch, heavy with all the words neither seemed capable of speaking. Eleanor filled her empty hours with exploration, wandering the endless corridors of Thornwood Castle like a ghost haunting her own life, and it was during these wanderings that she began to notice things that did not quite align with the fearsome reputation of its master. The servants, though reserved in her presence, showed none of the cowering terror she had expected from those employed by a cruel tyrant, and she overheard the cook humming contentedly in the kitchen, watched the groundskeeper whistle as he tended the rose gardens, observed the easy camaraderie among the footmen when they thought themselves unobserved. She learned from careful listening that the staff were paid generously, far above the standard wages, that the Duke had built new cottages for tenant farmers whose homes had grown decrepit, that he personally ensured every child on his lands had access to schooling, and every elderly worker received a pension upon retirement. These discoveries unsettled Eleanor, for they painted a portrait of a man quite different from the cold monster of reputation, and she found herself turning them over in her mind late at night, trying to reconcile the husband who barely looked at her with the landlord who apparently cared deeply for those in his charge. It was the library that saved her sanity, a magnificent room spanning 2 floors with a spiraling staircase connecting the levels, its walls lined floor to ceiling with thousands of volumes in leather bindings of every color, and Eleanor lost herself among the shelves with something approaching joy, rediscovering the pleasure of reading that poverty had nearly stolen from her when she had been forced to sell her own modest collection to pay creditors. She was curled in a window seat one afternoon, so absorbed in a volume of poetry that she did not hear Mrs. Blackwood enter until the housekeeper cleared her throat, and when Eleanor looked up, startled, the elderly woman was arranging a vase of delicate white roses on a nearby table, their fragrance filling the air with sweetness. Eleanor remarked on their beauty, mentioned without thinking that white roses had always been her favorite since childhood, and Mrs. Blackwood paused in her arranging, a strange expression crossing her weathered face before she admitted that she knew that His Grace had specifically instructed her to ensure the Duchess's chambers were always supplied with white roses, for he had noted her preference when she mentioned it during their first meeting at her father's estate, a passing comment Eleanor herself had forgotten making. The housekeeper departed before Eleanor could respond, leaving her alone with the roses and a heart suddenly racing with confusion. For what manner of cold, unfeeling husband noticed such small details and remembered them? What kind of monster ensured his unwanted wife was surrounded by her favorite flowers? And why did this tiny gesture of thoughtfulness shake her more profoundly than any grand declaration could have done? The question of who her husband truly was beneath his fortress of ice consumed Eleanor's thoughts in the days that followed the revelation about the roses, and she found herself watching for him with new attention, cataloguing small observations like a naturalist studying some rare and dangerous creature whose habits remained mysterious despite proximity. It was on a grey morning, nearly a fortnight after her arrival, that she ventured toward the stables in search of fresh air and solitude, pulling her shawl tight against the autumn chill that had descended upon Thornwood with sudden ferocity. And as she approached the weathered stone building, she heard something that stopped her mid-stride, a voice, low and gentle, murmuring words she could not quite discern, and though the tone was unfamiliar, something in its cadence made her certain it belonged to her husband. She crept closer, curiosity overcoming propriety, and through the partially open stable door, she witnessed a scene that shattered yet another fragment of the image she had constructed of the Duke of Ashworth. He was kneeling in the straw beside a chestnut mare whose leg was wrapped in bandages, his large hands impossibly tender as they stroked the animal's neck, and he was speaking to the creature in a voice Eleanor had never heard him use, soft and reassuring, promising that she would heal, that no one would harm her, that he would ensure she had all the time and care she needed to recover. The head groom stood nearby, cap in hand, and Eleanor heard him say that the mare would likely never be fit for riding again, that perhaps the kindest course would be to end her suffering, and the Duke's response came swift and sharp. There would be no talk of destruction. The horse would be given every chance. He would bring in specialists from London if necessary, and any man who suggested otherwise could seek employment elsewhere. Eleanor must have made some sound, for the Duke's head snapped toward the doorway, and she watched the transformation happen in an instant, the softness vanishing from his features, like mist burned away by harsh sunlight, his expression closing into its familiar severity as he rose to his feet, brushing straw from his trousers with movements that had become brusque and businesslike. He asked what brought her to the stables, his tone cool and formal, and Eleanor found herself stammering something about wanting air, about not meaning to intrude, and then, before she could think better of it, she heard herself thanking him for the roses in her chambers, acknowledging the kindness he had shown in remembering her preference. The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he dismissed her gratitude with a wave of his hand, declaring it merely a matter of household management, nothing more, the sort of detail any competent master would attend to for the comfort of his household. But even as he spoke these dismissive words, his eyes flickered over her, and she saw something register in his gaze, the way she was shivering despite her shawl, the inadequacy of her clothing against the cold, stable air, and without a word, without any acknowledgement of what he was doing, he shrugged off his own heavy coat and stepped forward to drape it around her shoulders, the wool still warm from his body, carrying the scent of him, something clean and masculine that made her breath catch unexpectedly. He turned and walked away before she could speak, disappearing into the grey morning, and Eleanor stood alone in the stable doorway, clutching his coat around her like armour, breathing in the warmth he had left behind, more confused than ever by this man who insisted he felt nothing, while his every action whispered of something far more profound than mere household management. The letter arrived on a morning when frost still clung to the windowpanes of Thornwood Castle, delivered on a silver tray by a footman whose expression betrayed nothing of its contents, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with inexplicable dread as she recognized the elegant script of Lady Hartwell, a woman whose invitations commanded attendance from the highest echelons of society, and whose balls were spoken of in reverent tones throughout London's most exclusive drawing-rooms. She had not yet broken the seal when the Duke entered the breakfast-room, his presence announced by the sudden stillness that seemed to follow him everywhere, and he glanced at the letter in her hands before settling into his chair with the newspaper, though she noticed he did not unfold it, his attention clearly fixed upon her, though he pretended otherwise. Eleanor opened the invitation with fingers that trembled only slightly, read the flowing words requesting the honour of the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth's presence at the season's most anticipated event, and felt the blood drain from her face as memories crashed over her like waves against a crumbling shore. The glittering ballroom, the whispered laughter, Frederick's cruel words echoing through the crowd, her own desperate flight through a sea of pitying and amused faces. The Duke's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, blunt and direct as always, demanding to know what the letter contained and why it had caused her to turn the colour of the snow outside. And when she managed to explain that society apparently expected his new Duchess to be presented, that their attendance at Lady Hartwell's ball was not merely requested, but required, if they wished to avoid scandal and speculation, something shifted in his expression that she could not quite identify. He stated flatly that they would attend, that arrangements would be made, and Eleanor heard herself agreeing in a voice that sounded distant and hollow to her own ears, but something in her face must have betrayed her true feelings, for the Duke set aside his newspaper entirely and fixed her with those piercing ice-blue eyes, asking with uncharacteristic directness what troubled her beyond the obvious inconvenience of the journey. She had not intended to tell him anything, had planned to bury her humiliation as she had buried so many other painful things, but the words emerged before she could stop them, a halting, abbreviated account of her last appearance in London society, of a man she had believed loved her, of public rejection and private devastation, though she could not bring herself to speak Frederick's name or describe the full extent of her shame. The Duke listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing, and when she finished her inadequate explanation, trailing off into uncomfortable silence, he was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to wonder if he had heard her at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that particular quality of cold authority that she had learned to recognize as his shield against the world, and his words were simple, brooking no argument and offering no false comfort. "You will attend as my Duchess, and that is sufficient." He rose from the table and departed without another word, leaving Eleanor alone with the invitation and the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being claimed, of belonging to something larger and more powerful than herself, and though she could not yet call it comfort, neither could she deny that his certainty had somehow steadied the trembling in her hands. The days that followed the arrival of Lady Hartwell's invitation passed in a flurry of activity that transformed Thornwood Castle from its customary austere calm into something resembling barely contained chaos, for the Duke had summoned London's most celebrated modiste to attend upon his wife, and Madame Beaumont arrived with 3 assistants, 17 trunks of fabric samples, and an air of barely suppressed excitement at the prospect of dressing a duchess for the season's most anticipated event. Eleanor stood in her chambers as the modiste circled her with measuring tape and critical eye, calling out numbers to an assistant who recorded them with frantic speed, and she felt rather like a horse being assessed at market, though she kept this observation to herself, as bolt after bolt of silk and satin were unfurled for her consideration. The Duke had specified midnight blue. Madame Beaumont informed her with evident approval, stating that His Grace possessed an eye for what would complement her Grace's colouring, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at the thought of her husband considering such matters, of him thinking about how she might look adorned in sapphire silk, and she wondered when precisely he had formed these opinions he had never voiced to her directly. The gown that emerged from the fittings over the following week was nothing short of extraordinary midnight blue silk that seemed to capture starlight in its folds, with delicate silver embroidery along the bodice, and a neckline that revealed more of her shoulders and décolletage than anything Eleanor had ever worn. Elegant and daring in equal measure, the sort of gown that announced its wearer as a woman of consequence and means. She protested, of course, when the jewels arrived in their velvet cases, sapphires that matched the gown with such precision that they must have been commissioned specifically for this purpose, a necklace of stones so large and brilliant they seemed almost impossible, earrings that caught the light with every movement of her head, a fortune in gems that could have fed her father's estate for a decade during their years of poverty. The Duke cut off her protestations with a sharpness that startled her, declaring that his Duchess would not appear before society in anything less than the finest, that he would not have London whispering about economy or want, and there was something in his voice that was not cold at all but fierce, almost protective, as though he were arming her for battle rather than merely dressing her for a ball. On the afternoon of the final fitting, Eleanor stood before the full-length mirror in her chambers, scarcely recognizing the woman who gazed back at her, not the desperate girl who had fled London in disgrace, not the practical wife who had accepted a transaction in place of a future, but someone altogether new, someone luminous and commanding in midnight silk and sapphires, someone who looked as though she had never known a moment of poverty or shame. She sensed him before she saw him, some awareness prickling along her spine, and when she turned her head she found the Duke standing in the doorway, his ice-blue eyes travelling over her with an expression she could not decipher, something intent and heated, that made her breath catch, something that might have been hunger or wonder or both, and then, before she could speak or he could explain his presence, he turned abruptly and strode away without a word, leaving Eleanor alone with her reflection and the unsettling, exhilarating certainty that whatever he had seen when he looked at her had shattered some wall she had not even known existed between them. The Hartwell ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames reflected in crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls from ceilings painted with scenes of classical mythology, and Eleanor felt the weight of every eye in that glittering assembly turn toward the entrance as she descended the marble staircase on the arm of the Duke of Ashworth, her midnight silk gown whispering against the steps, the sapphires at her throat catching fire with each movement, and she heard the whispers rise like a tide around her, the notorious Duke, the mysterious new Duchess, speculation and curiosity, and barely concealed fascination, rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat. She had prepared herself for this moment during the carriage ride from their London townhouse, had schooled her features into pleasant neutrality, and reminded herself repeatedly that she was no longer the desperate, doweryless girl who had fled this world in shame, yet nothing could truly have readied her for the sensation of returning to the scene of her greatest humiliation, transformed beyond recognition, draped in wealth and status that would have been unimaginable 2 years prior, and she felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. The Duke's arm beneath her gloved fingers was solid and steady, an anchor in the swirling sea of silk and jewels and predatory curiosity, and though his expression remained as severe as carved marble, she noticed how he positioned himself slightly in front of her, how his posture seemed to create a barrier between her and the pressing crowd, protective in a way that was entirely instinctive and therefore entirely genuine. They moved through the ballroom in a bubble of space that parted before the Duke's reputation, like water before the prow of a ship, and Eleanor searched the faces around her with growing dread, seeking the one visage she feared above all others, knowing with terrible certainty that Frederick would be here, that London's most celebrated event would naturally attract every ambitious social climber and fortune hunter in England. She found him near the refreshment tables, and the shock of seeing him after 2 years struck her like a physical blow. He looked older somehow, harder around the eyes, his handsome features carrying a petulant quality she had never noticed during the blind days of her infatuation, and beside him stood a woman in elaborate rose silk, who must be Lady Arabella, the heiress whose fortune had purchased his affections, her pretty face wearing an expression of bored misery that spoke volumes about the happiness money had bought her. Frederick's gaze swept the room with the calculating assessment of a man forever seeking better prospects, and Eleanor watched the precise moment when his eyes found her, watched them widen with recognition, then shock, then something that looked almost like hunger as he took in the sapphires blazing at her throat, the midnight silk that whispered of wealth beyond anything her family had ever possessed, the tall, dark figure of the Duke standing possessive and powerful at her side, and she felt a fierce surge of satisfaction, war with lingering hurt, as the man who had deemed her worthless now stared at her as though seeing her for the very first time. Lord Frederick approached with the confidence of a man who had never truly faced consequences for his cruelty, his champagne glass raised in greeting as he wove through the crowd toward them, and Eleanor felt her stomach clench with the visceral memory of humiliation as he drew near enough for her to smell the wine on his breath and see the calculating glint in eyes she had once thought handsome. "Lady Eleanor," he said, deliberately omitting her proper title as Duchess, his smile carrying the sharp edge of a man determined to wound. "How extraordinary to see you here, and looking so remarkably well. Some women simply know how to land on their feet, do they not?" Finding fortune where fortune seemed quite impossible, and his gaze traveled over her sapphires with naked covetousness, before returning to her face with an expression of false warmth that barely concealed the resentment beneath. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, though what words she might have summoned she would never know, for in that instant the Duke stepped forward with a movement so deliberate and controlled that it commanded the attention of every person within 20 feet, and the temperature of the air itself seemed to plummet as Marcus Thorne fixed his ice-blue gaze upon the man who had once shattered his wife's heart. "Lord Frederick Blackwood," the Duke said, and his voice carried with crystalline clarity across the suddenly silent corner of the ballroom, cold enough to freeze champagne in its glass. "I have heard a great deal about you, about your discerning nature, your careful consideration of worth, your meticulous assessment of value in all things," and though his words were technically civil, they landed like blows, each one precisely aimed. Frederick's smile faltered, uncertainty flickering across his features as he found himself facing a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was legendary. But before he could stammer a response, the Duke continued with devastating precision, "I confess myself astonished that a man of your supposed judgment could have so thoroughly failed to recognize quality when it stood before you, could have been so blinded by the glitter of gold that he discarded a diamond beyond price. A woman whose grace, intelligence, and dignity exceed anything your shallow comprehension could measure." The ballroom had gone utterly still, every ear straining to catch the words, every eye fixed upon the confrontation unfolding like a duel without weapons, and Eleanor watched Frederick's face drain of color as the Duke delivered his verdict before all of society. "My wife," Marcus continued, and there was something fierce and almost tender in the way he spoke that word, "possesses a worth that has nothing to do with dowries or fortunes, a worth that a man of your limited character could never appreciate, for it requires depth to recognize depth, and you, Lord Frederick, are as shallow as a puddle in summer." And then, with a contempt so cold it burned, "I pity whatever woman bound herself to such a man, and I thank Providence daily that your foolishness delivered such a treasure into hands capable of recognizing her value." Frederick stumbled backward as though physically struck, his face mottled red with humiliation as whispers erupted around them like wildfire, and he retreated into the crowd without another word, leaving Eleanor standing beside her husband in a bubble of stunned silence, her heart pounding with something that felt remarkably like triumph, while the Duke returned his attention to her with an expression that betrayed nothing except, perhaps, in the slight softening around his eyes, a satisfaction that matched her own. The carriage wheels clattered against cobblestones as they departed the Hartwell mansion, and Eleanor sat in the velvet darkness, with her heart pounding so fiercely she feared the Duke must surely hear it, the events of the evening replaying in her mind like scenes from a dream she could not quite believe had truly occurred. Frederick's cruel insinuations, the Duke's devastating response, the collective gasp of society, as the most feared man in England, had publicly declared her worth beyond measure, and she found herself trembling with an emotion she could not name, something vast and overwhelming that pressed against her ribs and threatened to spill from her eyes. "Your Grace," she managed at last, her voice barely above a whisper in the darkness of the carriage, "I must thank you for what you did this evening, for defending me against Lord Frederick's remarks." And she heard how inadequate the words sounded, how utterly insufficient to express the magnitude of what his intervention had meant to her, the healing balm it had applied to wounds she had carried for 2 long years. The Duke shifted on the seat across from her, his features barely visible in the flickering light of passing street lamps, and when he spoke his voice carried its customary coolness, though something beneath it seemed different, textured with an emotion she could not identify. "There is nothing to thank me for. I merely stated facts that any person of reasonable intelligence could observe, and I do not tolerate fools speaking nonsense in my presence." But Eleanor could not let the matter rest there, could not allow him to dismiss what he had done as mere practicality when it had felt like so much more, and she pressed forward with a courage born of the evening's strange alchemy. "Why did you truly defend me? Not as a matter of tolerating foolishness, but why did you speak of my worth as though it mattered to you personally, as though my honor was somehow your own to protect?" The silence that followed stretched between them like a living thing, and Eleanor watched the Duke's profile in the intermittent lamplight, saw the way his jaw tightened and his hands clenched upon his knees, and she wondered if she had transgressed some invisible boundary, if his walls were rising once more to shut her out. But then he spoke, and his voice was rough with something that sounded almost like vulnerability. "Because I cannot bear to see anyone diminish you because you have shown more grace and strength in the weeks since our marriage than most individuals display in entire lifetimes, and because the thought of that shallow, worthless man casting aspersions upon your character fills me with a fury I can barely contain." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, her heart suspended between beats, as she absorbed words she had never expected to hear from this man of granite and ice, and before she could formulate a response, she felt his hand reach across the darkness of the carriage to find hers, his fingers warm and strong as they interlaced with her own, and neither of them spoke another word for the remainder of the journey home. But neither did they pull away, and Eleanor sat in the swaying darkness with her hand clasped in her husband's, feeling something shift between them, something irreversible and profound, the first tender shoots of possibility breaking through the frozen ground of 2 wounded hearts. The weeks following the ball brought changes so gradual yet so profound that Eleanor could scarcely pinpoint when the transformation began, only that the man who had once seemed carved from winter itself now sought her company with an eagerness he barely troubled to conceal, appearing at breakfast each morning with a book he thought she might enjoy, or a question about something she had mentioned days before, proving that he listened, that he remembered, that she mattered in ways she had never dared to hope. They walked together through the gardens of Thornwood, as autumn painted the leaves in shades of gold and crimson, their conversations stretching longer with each passing day, touching upon philosophy and literature and the small memories of childhood that revealed who they truly were, beneath the armor they had each constructed against a world that had wounded them both, and Eleanor found herself sharing things she had never told, another soul, her mother's death, her fears of inadequacy, the dreams she had buried, so deep she had nearly forgotten their shape, while the Duke listened with an attention so complete it felt almost like reverence. It was during one such walk, as they paused beside a stone bench overlooking the lake, that he spoke of his first wife, and Eleanor held her breath as he revealed the truth behind the vicious rumors that had haunted him for years, that Catherine had been a gentle, fragile creature chosen by his father, that their marriage had been cordial but distant, that she had succumbed to a wasting illness of the lungs, despite every physician he had summoned, and that the whispers of madness and cruelty had been spread by rivals who envied his wealth and feared his influence. Poison poured into society's ears until the lie became accepted truth. Eleanor saw the grief etched in the lines around his eyes, the loneliness that had calcified into coldness as protection against a world eager to believe the worst. And she understood then that his walls were not signs of cruelty, but monuments to betrayal, fortresses built by a man who had learned that vulnerability invited destruction. "I stopped believing anyone could see past the rumors," he admitted, his voice rough with an honesty that seemed to cost him greatly. "I stopped hoping anyone would care to try," and Eleanor felt her heart crack open with compassion for this man who had endured so much in silence. When he asked about her dreams, What she had wanted before poverty and heartbreak had taught her to want nothing. She confessed that she had stopped dreaming entirely, that she had learned to desire only survival and security, because hoping for more had brought her nothing but pain, and the Duke turned to face her with an intensity that stole her breath, his ice-blue eyes holding something that looked almost like tenderness, as he said, "Perhaps it is time to begin again. Perhaps we might learn to dream together, you and I, if you would permit me the privilege of discovering what makes you happy." And Eleanor felt something flutter in her chest, fragile and hopeful and utterly terrifying, like the first green shoot emerging after the longest winter. The realization crept upon Eleanor like dawn breaking over the moors, gradual, inevitable, and utterly impossible to deny once the light had spread across the horizon of her heart. And she knew with a certainty that terrified her to her very core that she had fallen in love with her husband, the man she had married as a transaction, the Duke whom all of England believed incapable of tenderness, and the knowledge settled into her bones like both blessing and curse, for she had sworn upon the ashes of her shattered pride that she would never again make herself vulnerable to the devastation of loving someone who might not love her in return. Yet how could she help herself when he appeared each morning with some treasure he had discovered, a volume of poetry by an obscure Italian author she had mentioned, admiring months ago, procured from a bookseller in London at considerable expense, though he dismissed her gratitude as though the gesture meant nothing, or when she learned from Mrs. Blackwood that he had personally written to the tea merchant to ensure her preferred blend was always in supply, or when she descended one afternoon to find a portrait of her father hanging in her private sitting room, commissioned from a miniature she had brought from her old home, rendered in oils with such care and skill that she had wept at the sight of her father's gentle eyes gazing back at her from the canvas. He never spoke of these offerings, never drew attention to the quiet ways he was learning her heart and filling its empty spaces with evidence of his attention, and Eleanor found herself watching for him with an eagerness that would have shamed her former self, listening for his footsteps in the corridor, feeling her pulse quicken when he entered a room, treasuring each rare, almost smile that softened his severe features like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and she understood with growing wonder that his love was not spoken but enacted, written not in flowery declarations but in the language of consistent, thoughtful action that proved she occupied his thoughts even when they were apart. The tension between them grew with each passing day, building like pressure before a summer storm, their fingers brushing when he passed her a book, neither acknowledging the spark that leapt between them, his hand at the small of her back as they walked through the gallery, warm and steady and lingering longer than propriety required, the weight of his gaze upon her when he thought she was not looking, heavy with something that made her breath catch and her cheeks flush with heat she could not explain away. She caught him watching her one evening as she played the pianoforte, and when their eyes met across the candlelit room, something passed between them that needed no words, an acknowledgement of feelings that had grown beyond either of their intentions, and Eleanor saw in his ice-blue eyes a vulnerability that matched her own, a question he seemed afraid to ask, and she understood that he too was waiting, hoping, terrified of shattering the fragile miracle blooming between two people who had both learned that love could destroy as easily as it could save. The letter arrived on an evening when the first frost had begun to silver the windows of Thornwood, carried by a messenger who had ridden through the night, and Eleanor knew before she broke the seal that the news would wound her, for correspondence from the physician attending her father had grown increasingly frequent in recent weeks, each missive carrying the weight of decline that no amount of comfortable care could entirely forestall. She read the words through a blur of tears, a turn for the worse, a fever that had gripped him for 3 days before breaking, stable now but weakened, the physician cautioning that while immediate danger had passed, the Viscount's constitution could not sustain many more such episodes, and the letter trembled in her hands as she sat alone in the library, the fire crackling uselessly against the cold that had settled into her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the season and everything to do with the terrible helplessness of loving someone whose time was measured in months rather than years. She did not hear the door open, did not register the Duke's presence until he spoke her name, Eleanor, and she looked up to find him standing before her, his severe features shifting into something that might have been alarm as he took in her tear-streaked face and shaking hands, and before she could compose herself, before she could summon the dignity that had carried her through so many trials, He had crossed the distance between them and knelt before her chair, his hands reaching out to take hers with a gentleness that undid what remained of her composure entirely. "Forgive me," she whispered through her tears. "I should not, this weakness is unbecoming." But he stopped her words with a pressure of his fingers against hers, his ice-blue eyes holding her gaze with an intensity that stole her breath. "Strength," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before, "is not the absence of tears, but the courage to feel them. You weep because you love, and there is no weakness in that, only the proof of a heart brave enough to remain open when closing it would be easier." The words cracked something within Eleanor, some final barrier she had not known she was still maintaining, and she wept freely then, not caring how she appeared, and he remained kneeling before her, a duke upon his knees for a woman he had married as a transaction, his thumbs tracing circles upon the backs of her hands as though he could absorb her grief through touch alone. When her tears finally slowed, he spoke again, and his voice was halting now, stripped of its customary command, vulnerable in a way she had never witnessed. "I must tell you something. I find I cannot keep silent any longer, though I fear what I am about to say may change everything between us, and not for the better." He drew a breath, and Eleanor saw with astonishment that his hands were trembling. "When I proposed this marriage, I expected nothing, wanted nothing but the practical arrangement I described. I had armored myself against feeling, convinced myself that I was incapable of it, after Catherine, after the rumors, after years of isolation that taught me to want nothing so that nothing could be taken from me. But you," his voice broke, and he paused to master himself before continuing, "you have undone every defense I built. You have made me feel things I had forgotten were possible. I love you, Eleanor, desperately, completely, in ways I cannot articulate because I have never possessed the words for what you have awakened in me. If you cannot return this feeling, I will understand. I will never speak of it again, but I could not continue living beside you, watching you, wanting you, without confessing the truth." The silence that followed his confession stretched between them, fragile as spun glass, and Eleanor felt her heart pounding against her ribs as she looked at this man, this proud, wounded, beautiful man who had knelt before her and offered his heart without knowing if she would accept or crush it, and she understood that this moment would define the rest of her life. "I was so afraid," she whispered, and she watched hope flicker to life in his eyes. "So afraid of loving you, because I had sworn I would never again make myself vulnerable to that kind of pain. But I do love you, Marcus. I love you with everything I am, and you have healed wounds I thought would never close, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." The sound he made was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but something more profound than either, and when he rose and pulled her to her feet and into his arms, Eleanor felt the last of her walls crumble into dust, leaving only the truth of two wounded souls who had somehow, against all expectation, found in each other the home they had both stopped believing existed. The moment their confessions hung in the air between them, Eleanor felt the world shift on its axis, every carefully constructed wall she had built crumbling into nothing as Marcus drew her closer, his hands cradling her face with a tenderness that seemed impossible from a man the world called cruel. And when his lips finally met hers, she understood at last what the poets meant when they wrote of souls. Recognizing their mates, the kiss began soft, questioning, a gentle exploration that asked permission even as it offered everything, and she answered by pressing closer, her fingers curling into the fabric of his coat as years of loneliness and longing poured from her heart into his, and the kiss deepened into something more urgent, more desperate, as though they were both drowning and had found in each other the only source of air, and she felt his arms wrap around her waist, lifting her effortlessly from the chair, and she clung to him as he carried her through the darkened corridors of Thornwood, past the flickering sconces and the ancestral portraits that seemed to watch with approval, until they reached his chambers, chambers she had never entered, the threshold she had never crossed, and he paused there, his ice-blue eyes searching her face with such vulnerability that it stole her breath, silently asking if she was certain, if this was truly what she wanted, and she answered by pressing her lips to his once more, by threading her fingers through his dark hair, by whispering against his mouth that she had never been more certain of anything in her life. Their wedding night, delayed by weeks of careful distance and unspoken yearning, unfolded like a sacred ceremony, far more meaningful than the austere vows they had exchanged in that cold chapel. And Marcus was gentle in ways she had never imagined, his hands trembling as they learned the geography of her skin, his lips tracing paths of reverence across her shoulders, her collarbone, the hollow of her throat, murmuring her name like a prayer between kisses, and Eleanor discovered passion she had never known existed within her, a fire that answered his every touch with hunger of her own, and there was no fear in the darkness of his chambers, only safety, only the profound rightness of two souls finally coming home to each other after wandering lost for so long. In the aftermath, tangled together beneath silken sheets, they whispered the secrets they had guarded most closely. He confessed his terror that she would eventually see through to the wounded boy he had been, abandoned by a cold father and left to forge himself into stone simply to survive. She admitted her fear that she was unworthy of such devotion, that the girl Frederick had discarded must have been lacking something essential, and with each confession came absolution, each vulnerability met with acceptance rather than judgment, and Eleanor felt the last fractured pieces of her heart finally mend as Marcus held her against his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her back as though he could not bear to stop touching her even for a moment. She fell asleep in his arms as dawn began to lighten the edges of the heavy curtains, wrapped in warmth and safety and the overwhelming knowledge that she was loved completely, and her final thought before sleep claimed her was that she had entered Thornwood, expecting to find her prison, but had instead discovered her paradise, built not from grand gestures or flowery words, but from the patient, steady devotion of a man who showed his heart through action, and she knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges awaited them, they would face them together, bound not by the transaction that had joined their names, but by the love that had joined their souls. The weeks that followed their confession transformed Thornwood Castle in ways both subtle and profound, and when the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth returned to London society for the spring season, the Ton watched with barely concealed fascination as the man they had whispered about for years, the cold Duke, the cruel Duke, the Duke who had allegedly driven his first wife to madness, moved through ballrooms and garden parties with his hand perpetually at the small of his wife's back, his ice-blue eyes softening whenever they rested upon her face, his severe features relaxing into expressions of such tender regard that matrons who had known him for decades scarcely recognized the transformation, and Eleanor herself seemed to glow with a radiance that had nothing to do with the magnificent jewels at her throat and everything to do with the quiet certainty of being utterly, completely loved. At a garden party hosted by the Marchioness of Pemberton, the sun casting golden light across manicured lawns and elegant guests, Eleanor found herself momentarily separated from Marcus when a soft voice spoke her name, and she turned to find Lady Arabella Blackwood standing before her Lord Frederick's wife, the heiress whose fortune he had married, looking older than her years with shadows beneath her eyes and a brittleness to her smile that spoke of unhappiness worn like a second skin. "Your Grace," Lady Arabella said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wonder if I might speak with you privately for a moment," and Eleanor, though surprised, inclined her head graciously and allowed herself to be led to a quiet corner of the garden where climbing roses perfumed the air and shielded them from curious eyes. What followed was a confession Eleanor had never anticipated. Lady Arabella speaking haltingly of a marriage that had become a prison, of a husband whose charm had curdled into cruelty the moment her fortune was secured, of infidelities so numerous she had stopped counting, of debts accumulated despite her wealth, of cold silences and cutting remarks designed to diminish her spirit day by day, and through it all, Eleanor listened with a heart that held no triumph, only the profound pity one feels for a fellow creature caught in a trap of their own making. "I envy you," Lady Arabella whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I watch how the Duke looks at you, how he touches you as though you are precious beyond measure, and I understand now what I sacrificed when I chose a title and a handsome face over any consideration of character. You have found something real, something true, and I have found only guilt over rotting wood." Eleanor reached out and took the woman's hand, offering what comfort she could without false platitudes, and when they parted, she carried with her a deeper appreciation for the gift fate had given her in Marcus, a man whose fearsome reputation concealed the most devoted of hearts. Later, as the afternoon light mellowed toward evening, Marcus found her and drew her to his side, introducing her to his closest associates, men of influence and power, who had known him since Cambridge, with a pride in his voice that made Eleanor's heart swell, and she saw in their surprised but approving glances the recognition that the Duke of Ashworth had changed in ways they had never thought possible, that love had accomplished what nothing else could, and as they departed the party that evening, she overheard a whisper that would echo through drawing-rooms for seasons to come. The cruelest duke in England has been utterly conquered, and by love of all things, who could have imagined such a thing? 5 years had passed since that night in the library, when two wounded hearts had finally found the courage to speak their truth, and Thornwood Castle had transformed from a place of severe beauty and echoing silence into something Eleanor had never dared to dream. She would possess a home filled with warmth and laughter, and the particular chaos that only children can bring. And on this golden afternoon in late summer, she stood at the window of the morning room, with her hand resting gently on the swell of her belly, where their fourth child grew, watching the scene unfolding on the sun-dappled lawn below, with a heart so full she thought it might burst from the sheer weight of her joy. Marcus, her Marcus, the man the world had once called the cruelest duke in England, was on his hands and knees in the grass, heedless of his fine clothes, as their twin daughters Rose and Catherine, 4 years old, with their mother's chestnut hair and their father's striking blue eyes, clambered onto his back, shrieking with delighted laughter, while their infant son, William, barely a year old and toddling on unsteady legs, attempted to join the fray with the determined persistence he had inherited from both his parents, and Eleanor watched as her husband caught the baby with one strong arm, while the girls tumbled safely onto the soft grass, his deep laugh carrying through the open window to wrap around her heart like an embrace. Her father had lived to see Rose and Catherine born, had held them in his arms with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, had spent his final 2 years in comfort and peace in the east wing of Thornwood, surrounded by the grandchildren he had feared he would never have, and the son-in-law who had proven to be everything the rumors claimed he was not. And when he had passed quietly in his sleep on a gentle spring morning, Eleanor had mourned him deeply, but without the desperate anguish she would have felt had he died in that crumbling estate, alone and guilt-ridden and afraid for his daughter's future. That evening, after the children had been bathed and tucked into their beds by the nurse who adored them, Eleanor and Marcus retreated to the library that had witnessed so many pivotal moments in their love, their first real conversations, her tears over her father's illness, his confession that had changed everything, and sat together on the settee before the fire, her head resting against his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her as though even now, after 5 years of marriage and 3 children with another on the way, he could not bear to have her any distance from him. "I never knew happiness before you," Marcus said quietly, his voice rough with emotion as he pressed a kiss to her hair. "I thought I understood what life was, duty and obligation, and the management of estates, and the endless performance of what society expected, but I knew nothing of what it meant to truly live, until you walked into my world and showed me that beneath all the armor I had built, there was still a heart capable of feeling, still a soul worthy of being loved." Eleanor lifted her head to meet his eyes, those ice-blue eyes that had once seemed so cold and now held nothing but warmth when they looked upon her, and she traced the line of his jaw with gentle fingers, marveling as she still did every day at the gift fate had given her when it had seemed to take everything else away. "I thought love was a weakness," she replied softly, "a foolish fantasy that had nearly destroyed me once, and that I would never be foolish enough to pursue again. But you showed me that love, true love, the kind that grows from respect and trust, and the daily choice to put another's happiness alongside your own, is not weakness at all, but the greatest strength 2 people can share." They sat together in comfortable silence as the fire crackled and the ancient house settled around them, and Eleanor thought of how they had built something beautiful from a transaction, something eternal from what had begun as mere practicality, and she knew with absolute certainty that whatever years remained to them, they would face them together, their love, not the lightning strike of youthful infatuation, but the steady flame that would warm them through every season of their lives. Sometimes in the quiet hours of the evening, when the children were asleep and the house had settled into its familiar creaks and sighs, Eleanor would find herself reflecting on the strange and winding path that had brought her to this moment, this life she had never dared to imagine, this love she had sworn never to seek again, and she would marvel at how completely the world could transform when one least expected it, how the deepest wounds could become the very places where the greatest healing took root, and how a single decision made in desperation could blossom into something so beautiful it defied every expectation she had carried into that cold transaction 7 years past. She had been sold, in a manner of speaking, her hand exchanged for the forgiveness of debts, her future traded for her father's comfort, and she had walked into Thornwood Castle expecting nothing more than survival, a roof over her head, a life of quiet duty, to a man the world called cruel. Yet what she had found within those severe stone walls was a revelation that had reshaped everything she thought she knew about love and trust and the human heart's capacity for transformation. Marcus had taught her that appearances deceive in the most profound of ways, that the harshest exteriors often serve as armor, protecting the tenderest of hearts from a world that has given them every reason to hide, and she had learned that true love is not always the lightning strike of poets and dreamers. Sometimes it is something far more precious, a slow dawn, breaking after the darkest night, its beauty magnified by the very gradualness of its arrival, warming what had grown cold, inch by patient inch, until suddenly one realizes the sun has risen and everything is bathed in light. To those who have journeyed with Eleanor through these pages, who have felt her humiliation at Lord Frederick's cruel words and her resignation in that crumbling estate, who have watched her tentative hope bloom in the face of unexpected kindness and witnessed the walls around 2 wounded hearts crumble in a firelit library. Thank you for sharing in this story of redemption and healing, for believing alongside Eleanor that even the most broken among us deserve second chances at happiness. May her journey serve as a gentle reminder that love worth having is rarely love easily won, that the patience to see beyond surfaces reveals treasures the hasty will never discover, and that hearts brave enough to try again even after betrayal, even after humiliation, even after swearing never to be vulnerable once more, are hearts that find the deepest and most enduring joy. So believe in second chances. Dear friends, believe in the power of small kindnesses to transform cold arrangements into warm partnerships. Believe that somewhere in the world there is a love patient enough to wait for you to be ready, fierce enough to defend you against all who would diminish you, and tender enough to hold you through every storm. For Eleanor found such a love in the arms of the cruelest duke in England, and in finding it, she discovered that the cruelest duke was not cruel at all, merely waiting, as she had been, for someone brave enough to see the truth.